My name is Don Kennan. I'm the Vice President of the Historical Society, and I direct our scholarship and educational programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's book signing lecture. First, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Is Joseph T. Wilkins, who is the author of the book, the historical novel, The Speaker Who Locked Up the House, a book about Speaker Thomas Brackett Reed, who is really one of my favorite political characters in the history of the House of Representatives. Mr. Wilkins is a member of the Bar of the Supreme Court of New Jersey and the U.S. Supreme Court. He has practiced law in the Atlantic City, New Jersey area for over 40 years. He's served as chief attorney for Legal Services Program for the Poor, and at the other extreme has served as corporate counsel for multi-million-dollar corporations and as the founding chairman of the New Jersey State Bar Association's prestigious Committee on Casino Law. He has been the chief lawyer for the city of Atlantic City, and he has served as a municipal judge in his hometown. So Joe, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to you.
I am honored to be here, and I thank you for showing up and talk about Tom Reed, who was my favorite character. Those of you who are here may already know a good deal about him. But what has always intrigued me about this historical figure is that someone once referred to him as the most important politician nobody ever heard of. The man disappeared from history after his day. And his day, he became the Speaker on December 2nd, 1889, and he resigned from Congress in 1899. During that time, he was easily the most powerful political figure in the country. And I want to explain to you a little bit about why he was so powerful. When he was first elected from Maine, now Maine had a black population that was minuscule, less than 1%, still not much more than 1.8% or something like that. So he really hadn't been exposed to the kind of racist horror that existed in parts of this country. And when he came down the first time as a freshman, it was as part of the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876. In 1876, again, to refresh your memory a little bit, that was a tie. It led to tremendous charges back and forth of corruption, and it went down to the wire. It went down to the House of Representatives to finally make the call. And although they chose Rutherford B. Hayes, it was part of a pretty bad deal. The Democrats at that time controlled the House, and the Republicans wanted their man Hayes in there. So finally, they cooked up a deal, and the deal was essentially if Hayes would put an end to Reconstruction, eliminate the military rule in the South, put the troops down there on a short leash, then he could have the White House, which of course was a death warrant for thousands of black people. When that happened, the outcry of corruption and anger around the country was enormous. So a committee was got up in Congress, which was called the Potter Committee, and it was set up to investigate these charges back and forth of fraud in the election. Now, Reed had been a state senator in Maine, and he had been the Attorney General of Maine, and so as a freshman congressman, he was put on this very important committee. And as he attended the hearings of the committee, he was shocked to his core, because what he was finding at hearings, for example, in Louisiana, were instances in which a black man who was active in politics in East Feliciana Parish had a rope tied around his neck and was dragged around his own farm in front of his wife and kids until his body fell apart. Now, when that happened, Reed was as outraged as we are today about this young man in Florida, Tavor Martin, who was shot by a guy in the neighborhood watch, or allegedly shot. We have to give the guy some chance for a hearing. But it's an outrage. And Reed's moral standards were totally shocked. The result of it was that he began to understand what was going on in the country. And what was going on was that the Democratic Party, and I am a liberal Democrat, I'll give everybody warning, but it was topsy-turvy. In those days, the Republicans were the progressives, guys like Tom Reed and Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and a lot of people like that, and the Democrats were the ex-slave owners, right, and the ex-Confederate military people. So the result of it was that when you look at the history of that time, you sort of have to, you have to think of it as being topsy-turvy. Who was the who was the progressive and who was the conservative? And when Reed spent the next years in the minority, in the Republican progressive minority, he began to understand how fully the conservative Democrats controlled Congress. And they did that by violently suppressing the black vote in the South. Now, I'll give you an example of that. There was a fellow from Georgia by the name of Charlie Crisp, and Charlie later became the Speaker of the House after Reed left. Well, Charlie Crisp was 16 years old when he joined the Confederate Army, and he ended up getting captured and spent time in a prison camp, and when he got out, he got into politics. But Charlie Crisp, in 1888, was elected to Congress with 1,764 votes. Now, my good wife Mary Ann, when she ran for mayor of our hometown, got more than 1,700 votes. We're not talking about a margin. We're talking about a total vote for a man that became the Speaker of the House. And that was in a district that had 30,000 eligible voters, right? And why in 30,000 would a fellow only get a total vote of 1,600 and so, 1,700? And the reason was because most of those 30,000 were blacks, and if they voted, they died. It's as simple as that. There were burnings, there were lynchings, there was terror, there were night riders, and there were, in many cases, state-sponsored rifle clubs that issued state-owned Winchester rifles to night riders under the guise of local rifle clubs. And they would use these. They would sometimes get 50 or 100 guys on horseback, would go out and shoot up the black population. And Reed saw this, but he also saw that America was a dynamically growing country. We wanted stuff. We wanted a big navy. We were becoming a power in the world. It was 25 years after the Civil War. And we wanted to have railroads. We wanted to have improvements to our ports. We wanted to have internal improvements. We wanted to have everything that goes with being a world power. And we were very conscious that we were becoming a world power. But the Southern effect was that if anything was coming down the pipeline that looked like it might challenge the grip that the white supremacists had on the political process and the control of Congress, it couldn't get through. And the way that they stopped it from getting through was what they called the silent quorum. Now, the silent quorum was a trick by which, if you were in the House of Representatives and some legislation was being considered, you'd argue against it, you'd do what you could to amend it. But when push came to shove, if you didn't want it to get through and you were in the minority, what you would do would be suggest the absence of a quorum. And when you suggested the absence of a quorum, that triggered a roll call. And when there would be a roll call, the Speaker, or the Clerk of the House rather, would call out Jones of Idaho, Magruder of Wisconsin, whatever it would be. And if the member sitting right there, as you're sitting here today, if the member didn't answer to his name, he could not be counted as making up a quorum. And therefore, you could stop legislation from proceeding at all. Now, let's look at the numbers that existed when Tom Reed became the Speaker. The members of the House, when the country first started, there were 65 members. By 1890, December 2nd, 1889, really, by that time, the membership of the House had grown to 330. The Constitution provides that a quorum to do business in the House and the Senate has to be one more than a majority. Well, let's look at the math. Take a 330 and divide it in half, you come up with 165. If you add one, you're at 166, and you had to have a quorum of 166. The vote between the two parties was so even that on the most important single vote to start the Congress, which is to elect the Speaker, Tom Weed got elected, he got elected Speaker of the House with exactly 166 votes. All right? Now, that's what you call a razor-thin majority. It's about as close as you can get. And he had the problem of the way that life was lived in Congress in those days, because you didn't have jet airplanes, you didn't have telephones, you didn't have television, you didn't have railroads in many places, so you couldn't really command your quorum. You couldn't be sure everybody would be here. And the second problem that existed was if they were here, they might be drunk, they might be in the whorehouses, they probably would be in the pool rooms, all right, because they had no offices, they had no real committee staff, some but not many, and to them, a day in Congress was a day of going into a hot, unair-conditioned hall in the summertime and sitting there with everybody hitting the spittoons as best they could and being bored to death waiting for different things to be read out. So getting a quorum was tough. And then you had the flu. The flu was wiping out people all over the eastern seaboard, like a guy named Sweeney. Sweeney was a contractor. On Friday, Sweeney was in good health. He was known by a lot of congressmen. On Friday, he was in good health. On Saturday, he started to cough, and on Sunday, he was dead. That scared a lot of people. It scared a lot of the congressmen who didn't want to come into the chamber. So there's Reed trying to get a quorum to do things and couldn't do it. Now, let me talk a little bit about Tom Reed. He was probably the most deadly wit that ever got into Congress. He had a tongue that could cut you into little pieces. For example, a congressman named Springer once used that lovely Henry Clay quote, I think it's from Henry Clay, which pompously said is, "I would rather be right than be president." And Reed faced this one time too many, and he said, "The gentleman will never be either." You don't recover from that kind of stuff too easy. It gets in the papers and it goes back home and you look like an idiot. So Reed was the kind of wit that people didn't really like to mess around with too much. When he came to be Speaker, he had a progressive agenda. One of the things that was going on was that we had a tremendous surplus. In those days, there was no income tax. The government supported itself by customs duties. And when you had a tariff, which we had to protect the manufacturers here from English competition mostly, it generated money, and that money piled up. Well, here are the Democrats in the South saying, we don't want to see money get spent, we don't want to see all these different things, we want to get rid of the tariff. And the manufacturers in the North who are saying, keep the tariff, it's protecting us from this competition. So they were making money on it. Congress was making money, the government was getting fat, and there was a big argument about how do we spend it, right? Now, what Reed's agenda was, he wanted to boost the pensions for the Civil War veterans. Remember, this is 25 years after the Civil War. Let me tell you about what that meant. In the House, on the day he was elected Speaker, there were 169 veterans of the Civil War. Out of 330 members, 169 were veterans. And there were guys on that floor, excuse me, there were guys on that floor that had lost legs or arms or brothers or fathers or sons, cousins. You know, everybody had seen something really bad. They'd been at Chickamauga, they'd been at Antietam, they'd been at Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee's son, Fitzhugh Lee, was a general in the Civil War. He was there. Joe Wheeler from Alabama was a general in the cavalry in the Confederacy. He was there. Joe Wheeler had 16 horses shot from under him while he was in skirmishes and battles. He was a member of that Congress. Right? Nathaniel Banks was there. He was a general. And a lot of Confederate cavalry colonels were there. 90 of the veterans, 90 of the veterans were Republicans, right? And 69 of them were Democrats. So if you picture the House floor, as Tom Reed would look upon it, had they been in the Civil War uniforms, there would have been 90 guys in Union blue and 69 guys in Confederate gray. These guys knew what they had fought for. They knew why they had risked their lives and lost their friends. And now, 25 years later, after the surrender, what was at stake, as both sides saw it, was whether or not the North really won the Civil War. Because from the Southerners' point of view, they had regained control of the Congress, they were able to stop legislation they didn't want, and they were certainly able to stop any kind of civil rights legislation. From the Union point of view, they couldn't tolerate this blockage. They had to find a way to free up Congress. They had to find a way to get stuff done. Now, they called what was going on in the House a filibuster, all right? Not in the sense that you talk forever as you do in the Senate, but in the sense that you could demand a roll call, which took half an hour, and then you could demand another roll call on your appeal. Then you could demand another roll call. You could demand bills be read in full and all the rest of it. And that meant that the Southerners had a lot of weapons that they could use to keep legislation stopped that they wanted to have stopped. When Reed tried to get things through, he realized that he would first have to find a way to break the power of the white supremacists in the South. And that way was the federal elections bill. And the federal elections bill would have provided that federal troops would go back into the South, to protect black voters going to the polls. Now, if that bill had become law, that meant that the Democratic white party in the South would be history, would be gone. Mississippi had 1 million blacks and 600,000 whites. Almost every state in the South had that kind of imbalance. Look at Charlie Crisp, elected with 1,700 votes. If they had protection for the black voters trying to register and vote, how long would Charlie last? You know, he wouldn't make it past the next election. So the force bill, which is what the Southerners dubbed it, became very, very important. That would have sent these troops back. And you can imagine what this meant to Confederates who had fought to protect slavery, who had insisted on states' rights, who had insisted that they were fighting for freedom and democracy. They were fighting basically to suppress what they thought was an inferior race. This was a do-or-die situation for them. They had to stop it. And Tom Reed, none of this was secret, it was in the papers beforehand, Tom Reed was the man that was going to break the logjam in the House and let this legislation be passed. And at that time, he had a majority of 102. The Senate was safely Republican, and the president was Benjamin Harrison. So if he could get it through this House, the Senate would probably pass it, and the president would sign it, the force bill would be in effect, and that would be the end of the Democratic Party in the South. The stakes could not have been bigger. Enormous stakes. Now, in order to do that, Reed's first step was, his first priority was to break the silent quorum. He had to be able to do something to change the way the quorum was counted so that he could count people who were present. And this became the first big fight. He wanted to change the formal rules. He wanted to be able to change the House rules in detail. But his problem was that he had this skinny majority. There were 17 seats contested that year. And a contested seat means somebody comes along and says, you didn't win that election, I won that election. And these 17 seats were almost all Southern seats in which terror or fraud, murder, or the stealing of ballot boxes was provable. So Reed wanted to basically take these contested election cases, get them through, win his cases, and then build his majority. Because for every Democrat there by fraudulent means that you get rid of, you replace him with a Republican. Now the whole thing switches by 2 votes, right? So if he could get enough of these seats won, he could in fact get the rules passed that he wanted. Now, the votes themselves that came on these things still required, even though they were party votes, they still required evidence. Every politician knew you can't just vote for the minority to be thrown out and then replace them with one of your guys. So that meant you had to gain evidence. And the evidence that you gained would be stuff like this. An election would be held in Plumerville, Arkansas, totally black community. that election would have produced maybe 400 or 500 black votes, every one of whom voted Republican. These people still remembered Abraham Lincoln. And everyone would have been Republican. And what happened? When the election was over, masked guys carrying Winchesters showed up in Plumerville. They walked in and they stole the ballot box. All right? Just out and out stole it. And when you had one election in Plumerville, that election, John Clayton went there, having been the losing Republican, but he wanted to get the evidence to prove that, in fact, he had won that election. So he goes to Plumerville, and he tries to get affidavits from black voters that they voted, the box was stolen, and so forth. Well, John Clayton, while he's on this evidence-gathering trip, is staying at the home of a widow of somebody who had served with him in the war, a white widow, and when he comes back from trying to gather some evidence, he's sitting there writing a letter to his daughters back in his hometown, and night murderers came up and shot through the window and blew his head off. I still get emotional thinking about this. They blew his head off, all right, just trying to contest this election. When the other votes came in, one of them was a sheriff in Jericho, Arkansas. And this sheriff was responsible for providing the ballot boxes that would be used for the votes. And he had a ballot box made, or a kind of ballot box, that was made out of some kind of metal, and it had a little chimney on the top of it. And the little chimney was a little metal affair that sat on top of the slot in the ballot box. Well, you went to put your ballot down there, but you didn't do it yourself. You had to hand that to the judge, and the judge of the election was the guy who would then drop it down the slot. The slot had, because of this sheriff's changes, had two ways to go when the ballot went in there. If it was flipped this way a little bit, it would go into the ballot box. If it was flipped this way a little bit, it would fall to the floor out of sight. Now, that made the judge a pretty important man. The law provided that the judges were supposed to be half Democrat and half Republican. However, the year before, the rifle clubs under the sheriff, Sheriff Warner, actually went into the courthouse and at rifle point ordered the county judge out of the courthouse and told him to get out of town by sundown or you're dead. All right? They drove out 6 of the county officials in that county at gunpoint. And then, declaring a vacancy, they had the governor appoint new judges, the new county judge, who then appointed all the new election judges, all of whom were what they called in those days Winchesters. They appointed guys who were open racists, determined to protect and fight the black control by whatever force was necessary. As these scandals came to light, as the public began to understand the horrors that were going on, Reed began to gain strength. Finally, you get to January 29th, 1890, the first election case is coming up. And the report comes back from the elections committee that says this is what happened. We think the Republicans should be seated. When that vote was taken, the Republicans could only muster 162 votes. And the Democrats said no quorum. The names are called. And as the names are called, the Democrats who were there were 230 members in that House before the quorum call was called for. They're clearly a quorum. The Democrats basically refused to answer to their names, as they had for 100 years. All right? And everybody knew that this was going to be when the stuff hit the fan. So Reed sits at his speaker's desk, and the reporters up in the House gallery behind the speaker's desk are looking down, seeing what's going on. And Reed's got his pen out and a piece of paper, and as the names are called, he's writing down the names of the guys that he sees that don't answer to the name. And this is visible from above, and the Democrats know something like this is about to pop. When it proves there's no quorum, Speaker Reed said, "A chair directs the clerk to record the names of those members not present." And he starts to read. And as he's reading these names, the Democrats break out in rage. And I mean physical rage. These guys, Joe Wheeler, this fighting Confederate cavalry general, he climbs up onto a chair, and then he climbs up onto a desk, and then he jumps from desk to desk trying to get at the speaker, right? And finally his friends grabbed him and held it back. A Texas congressman is there, got a Bowie knife out, sitting in the front row, and he's sharpening the Bowie knife on the sole of his boot, looking at Reed. There were screams of outrage. Dictator, czar, terrible, this is oppression, and all the rest of it. And if you think Joe Wilson yelling at Barack Obama, "You lie," a couple of years ago was dramatic, you can imagine 70 or 90 Confederates jumping up and screaming and saying this has got to stop. It didn't stop. Reed was able to hold his temper. The more the Democrats attacked him, the more the Republicans had to support him. So he ended up holding his party together, and he managed to count them into the quorum, which became a historic event. And after he counted them in, he seated that congressman, and then over the next months, he seated another 15 or so, 14 or so more Republicans, which gave him the margins he needed. And finally, he got the rules amended. And if you look at Rule 15 of the House rules today, you will find that it provides that the Speaker can reject motions made for purposes of delay, and he can count the quorum if the people are present. But there were some comic moments in this. And one of the comic moments was the Democrats, when they realized the jig was up in that sense, they said, well, we'll just get the heck out of the House when the roll is called. So Charlie O'Farrell, who was the one of the minority leaders, had been the last Confederate, I think, defending the Shenandoah at the end of the Civil War. But Charlie O'Farrell was the point man. He was the man left in the House to protect the Democrats' interest once they said no quorum. All the other guys would say all out, and out they would go. And Reed then had to send out the sergeants at arms to hold these guys back in. It wasn't always successful because over time they took to hiding. Now, one of the things I didn't know when I started to write this book is that, I didn't realize, the congressmen really lived in boarding houses. They didn't have much in the way of bathing facilities, all right? They had some, but not very good. But in the House, they had put in marble bathtubs made out of Carrara marble from Italy. Big bathtubs, right? And they had 6 or 8 or 9 of them. And they had a barber shop, and there were a lot of bars and restaurants in the House and everything else, which was, in effect, their hotel while Congress was going on. They had to go elsewhere to sleep, but they didn't have offices. They didn't have all the usual amenities that we expect now. So they took to hiding, where the sergeants at arms couldn't find them. And one of the places they hid was in those bathtubs. And I have to thank the lady who was the guide years ago who told me that, and she took me downstairs and showed me they've got 2 of these bathtubs left. And it's comical when you go down there. You look at them, you can see these guys down there sitting in the bathtub having a cigar, and all of a sudden a sergeant at arms shows up and says, "Gotcha," and gets them back. Well, finally Reed got tired of that hide-and-go-seek game, so he ordered the doorkeepers of the House to lock the doors. Once the members were in the House and he had his quorum, the sergeants at arms barred the doors. Well, think of who you're boarding in there. You're locking in there. You are not locking in a bunch of debaters from the school debating society. You are locking in guys who have killed. You are locking in guys who have shot cannon and who have endured it. You are locking in people who have a great personal honor that they will not be bullied, right? And these are tough guys, and they locked them in. Well, the first thing that happened was the Democrats tried to hide. As they realized they were locked in, they tried to hide under their desks, and they tried to get behind curtains and all the rest of it. The reporters, by the way, had a real good time telling these stories in the newspaper. They tried to hide, and they couldn't hide. And as that happened, Tom Reed kept pushing things along. Now the Democrats, realizing that they couldn't hide, tried to escape. Well, picture the House. To try to escape, they try to get up on the desk and boost each other up into the galleries to be able to get out. Well, there was a problem with that. The problem was that Tom Reed's work on behalf of the Force Bill, which was a civil rights bill, had drawn every black guy in the know to be there early in the days to get a seat in the gallery. And who were these guys? They were ex-Union combat veterans who were black, and they're in the galleries. And as the Democrats are trying to get up into the galleries, these guys are pushing them back down. Right? And the reporters are having a field day watching this. Yeah, you can see the humor in this is comical, but it was deadly serious business. In any event, it finally ended up with a Confederate colonel by the name of Buck Kilgore from Texas. And Buck Kilgore says, "You will not imprison me." And he reaches his foot up and he kicks out the door of the House. Well, as it happened, one of the Republicans was trying to get back in then, and he had bent down to look through to see if this was the right moment, and the door caught him in the nose and busted his nose. But Kilgore got through, and he leads the Democrats out. Well, you can see the story here. No editor could resist it. This was a worldwide story. Everybody was watching the stuff anyway. Kilgore ended up having bootmakers from Italy and France and England send him free boots if he would tell them the size of his boot. And it became famous as Kilgore's kick. But Reed finally was able to get the rules changed, and those are the rules we have today. Now, when that happened, that he got the rules changed, he was able to get through a lot of progressive legislation, including the Force Bill, including the Federal Elections Bill. But at that time, McKinley was trying to get the tariff improved from their point of view. And the Republicans in the Senate sold out. Basically, Senator Quay of Pennsylvania cut a deal. The Democrats said to him, "You want the Force Bill and you want the tariff bill. And we'll concede that if you put everything behind it, you can get one of these. Which do you want?" That is, in my view, when the Republican Party sold its soul. It went for the tariff. And that meant that the Force Bill never got through. When that congressional election was next held, it was what Tom Reed called the slaughter of the innocents, right? They ended up, instead of having 166 or 169 Republicans or 173 as they had climbed to, it ended up that they had 88. And the Democrats controlled the House. They elected Charlie Crisp as Speaker. The first thing that they did was throw out Reed's rules. They threw out that and they went back to the silent quorum. And Reed had to just put up with it for that Congress. In the next Congress, the Republicans came back a little bit to where they had 127 members, all right? And now Reed really came into his strength. He used the silent quorum to tie the majority up in absolute knots. Now, by that time, Grover Cleveland was president, the Democrats had taken control of the Senate, and now they had control of the House, and they wanted to get through their stuff, but now their best weapon was in the hands of their worst enemy. And Tom Reed had them so tied up that they would be days when the Democrats could not, of their own, get a quorum because guys were out running for re-election and taking care of the law businesses and everything else. And Reed would basically order his troops to keep their mouths shut and sit there. And finally, after this went on for months, Charlie Crisp gave in. And the Democrats brought back Rule 15. The Democrats, Reed's biggest opponents, adopted the rule that he had fought for. And that is what has given the House to this day the ability to do what the majority wants. No matter how much people may agree with it, it is majority rule in the House. And you can compare that with the Senate. And Reed had great scorn for the Senate. that they didn't break the filibuster to. They never did that. Now what happens? 41 guys out of 100 in the Senate can stop everything. You can't do that in the House. You'd like to stop it. You'd like to stop this or that. But as a practical matter, because of Tom Reed, whoever's got the gavel can get things done. Nancy Pelosi got the health stuff through. John Boehner is having a little more problem on his own side of the aisle, but nonetheless, the majority votes, that's what's going to happen. Anyway, I've talked for a long time, and I had a good time writing all this. The book is back there. It's a fat 700-page book. Has a lot of history in it that I hope you will enjoy. But if you love history, as I'm sure you do, and you have a little sense of humor, you will enjoy. This was a Congress in which Speaker Reed at one point had to shut down the ladies' lounge because it was a whorehouse. The lobbyists were using the ladies' lounge and bringing up congressmen to line them up on behalf, essentially, of the tariff, and that did that. A former congressman, was shot and killed on the steps of the House. All right, Preston Talby of Kentucky had been a big, boorish kind of a guy, and he got a girl in the patent office pregnant. And he treated her really lousy. And the reporters got ticked off at this. So they wrote stories about it. And they didn't run him in Kentucky, Talby's home state. And Charlie Kincaid was the reporter for the Louisville Times. And finally his editor said, "Hey, Charlie, they're running this story all over the country. How come we don't have it in Kentucky?" So Charlie had to write a story. Talby lost the next election, and he blamed Charlie Kincaid. And he bullied him. Charlie Kincaid was a little 5-foot-tall, nervous guy, and Talby was a big bully. And at one point, he actually took his nose and twisted it, which is sort of a supreme insult. If you're going to have a guy reach for his sword, that's what's going to happen. Well, Charlie Kincaid went out and got a pistol, because Talby often was armed. And as they broke to come down for lunch to the House restaurant at the bottom of the stairs on the House side, Kincaid went up to Talby and he said, "I'm back." And I don't know whether he said I'm armed or not, but Talby turned around, Charlie Kincaid shot him. Talby lived for about 2 or 3 weeks after that, but then he died, and Kincaid was charged with murder. And he beat the rap because, first off, the press was unanimously on his side. The entire Kentucky delegation first agreed to be pallbearers for the late lamented Preston Talby, and then they volunteered to be character witnesses for the guy that killed him. So politics was lively in those days. And when the Congress opened, they found that somebody had stolen the congressional payroll. Now, there was a guy there named Eddie Silcott, Fast Eddie, and Eddie Silcott had a family, but he also had a girlfriend, and he was big on the horses, but he couldn't quite tell the fast ones from the slow ones. So the result of it was that Eddie Silcott would get the congressmen to sign vouchers to get their pay, and then he would take the vouchers down to the Treasury and get the cash, and he'd bring it back and he'd put it in the safe in the Sergeant at Arms office. Well, on the day that the new Congress came in, Eddie Silcott disappeared. And he disappeared with about $73,000 of the congressman's cash. And that sounds like a fairly human failing, but it turned into a political disaster. And the reason it did was because the question came up, whose money did Eddie Silcott steal? Was he stealing it from this congressman who was entitled to his pay? If he stole it from the government, you'd have to pass another Appropriations Act to reimburse the congressman. But if he stole it from the congressman, that was the problem between the congressman and Eddie Silcott. It wasn't a government duty to pay him. And what really confounded it was, those of you who are familiar with any kind of government forms, the Treasury had a form, and the form that a congressman signed to get his $440 a month, the form basically was a receipt. It said, you know, I'm entitled to get paid, and I acknowledge receipt of the cash. And they would give this to Eddie Silcott, who waltzed downtown, got the cash, came back, and then skipped for points unknown. And even the Democrats realized, if some idiot signed that he received his pay, we can't pay him again. The voters won't stand for it. We'll lose 20 or 30 seats on that kind of an issue alone. So the upshot of it was that finally they did find a way to reimburse him. But Eddie never got caught. Eddie skipped town with his girlfriend Louisa, and the last he was heard of was that he might be in Oregon, and then again he might not. He was interviewed at one point in Canada, and he said, "I have taken the best legal advice, and I cannot be extradited." So it was a lovely thing. And finally, the kind of humor that went on, I want to share one thing with you. One of the things that shows you what was going on is the New Orleans Picayune ran an editorial in the summer of 1890. And the editorial was headed, and ladies, you're going to love this, "The Decay of the White Male Mind." And it turned out that in that year, the top honors in Cambridge, Britain's highest university, went to a woman. And the top honors in Harvard, America's leading university, went to a black guy. Right? So the Times-Picayune had a lot of fun with us. And they said, well, the women basically don't have much else to do, so they have to study, and the blacks aren't admitted to most of the fraternities and so forth, so they had to study. But we have better basketball players. So there was a lot of fun in that Congress that was going on. It was an enormous lot of fun to write this book and to research it, and I hope you all get a chance to read it. I got some copies back there. I'll be glad to autograph any that you want. It's also available, as Don said, on Kindle and the Nook. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Everything that happened on the floor and everything said by one of the historically public figures is true. It's taken from the New York Times or the Congressional Record. I went damn near blind reading these microfiche things over the years. But the reason I wrote it as a novel is because this was a story of black and white. If you wanted to tell the real horrors of what was going on in the South, and you want to do it, they weren't really covered. The Southern newspapers really didn't describe the horrors that accurately. In Barnwell, South Carolina, for example, 8 black guys were locked up, and some masked riders came along, broke them out of jail, and then lynched them. Right? There were no black writers at that time. There were not enough of them anyway. They were able to get ink. They were able to really tell these kind of horrible stories. And you couldn't tell the story from the point of view of the black people that went through it unless you invented some characters to do that. I took liberties. Had there been justice in those days, there would have been a lot of good black reporters out there. But I think there was a notice in one of the papers in 1890 that a Negro reporter showed up in the press gallery. Right? And this was considered, a really wild thing. And it's the same with women. Women's histories basically were not written from within Congress. They didn't get to speak. Don sponsored a number of talks recently in which they featured the first black guys who could even address the House of Representatives. So you couldn't tell that side of the story from what you saw in the newspapers, where all the reporters were white, the editors were all white, or from the Congressional Record, where the only guys that could say anything were white men. So I looked at that and I thought, let me try it as a history. But then I thought, no, that won't fly. I have to be able to tell this story in a more lively sense to make it come alive. Cabot Lodge was a member of the 51st Congress, and he was in favor of that Sherman Antitrust Act. One of the circle, one of the friends of all of these guys was Teddy Roosevelt, who at that time I think was a chairman of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, the new Civil Service Commission. So the Republicans had a very deep bench of progressives. They had guys that wanted to curb the abuses of big business and the trusts. They had guys that wanted to do things for the populist farmers. They had guys that were trying to do things for civil rights. That was the year, incidentally, when women first voted in a federal election. Now, you're all going to tell me that actually that didn't happen until the passage of the Constitutional Amendment. But that was the year in which Wyoming was admitted as a state. And under the Constitution, an eligible voter for a federal election is someone who is eligible to vote for the lower member of the state legislature. And when Wyoming made its constitution to be able to be admitted as a state, all right, they protected the right of women to vote for their lower house. So when Wyoming became a state, which was when, in 1890, the woman became the first woman who could actually vote in federal elections. And that caused a lot of consternation. At one point, there was, and the debates on the floor were so much fun and so lively. But one of them was a Democrat was protesting against women. I cannot support this because I do not think that women should be drawn out of the home into the coarse life of politics, right? And one of the Republicans, you could kiss the man, he said, if you are that afraid of the influence of flouncing petticoats in the House, then let your wife run for Congress. It cannot fail to improve the appearance, and it will certainly improve your arguments. I mean, these guys they were so fast and so good. And then finally you got to the fist fight. You got guys sitting there in the heat of the summer that went on and on and on, and they're waiting for these obstacles to be overcome, and they're roasting in their shirts, and tempers got short. And Joe Cannon, who later became a powerful Speaker of the House, and who the Cannon House Office Building is named for, but Joe Cannon finally lost his temper, and somebody came up and said to him, well, in my opinion, blah, blah, blah. And Joe Cannon says, your opinion ain't worth a fart in a windstorm. Well, the woman immediately got up and left the galleries. And the guy he said this to says, you know, Joe, and this is two Republicans, you understand. The guy says, Joe, you can't use kind of language. My wife and kids are up in the galleries. You can't use that. It's trouble. And then another Republican jumps into it and he says, no, no, no. He says, he can use that language. You deserve it. And the first guy says, you son of a bitch. And he hauls off and he throws a punch. Well, now you're on the Republican side of the House. You got 4 or 5 Republicans fighting. One guy's yelling, don't hit me, I'm trying to break it up. And as this goes on, the Speaker has to order the mace carried down. And the mace, as you know, is the solemn symbol of authority in the House. And the Sergeant at Arms takes the mace and he walks over to the members to break it up. And as he breaks it up, poor Tom Reed is sitting there. He hasn't had a fight among the Democrats all through these stormy sessions, and it's his own Republicans that are now fighting each other. So, as I say, it was a lot of fun. Democrats, angry at the breaking of a silent quorum, got to the front, and they said, Mr. Speaker, I challenge your right to count me as present. And Reed had been going through this thing sweetly and keeping his temper, and then he stopped, and the whole House quieted down because he was obviously going to say something, and it was time to hear what he wanted to say. He said, the chair is making a statement that the gentleman is present. Does the gentleman care to deny it? Well, that erupted in laughter, and the reporters, they almost ran out of ink writing down. He never explained his passion. I thought, why would anybody take the abuse this guy took? I mean, why, you know, there's always a political way to avoid that kind of stuff and make a compromise or something, but he was taking it on the chin every day through that summer. And everybody is fascinated by the chess player aspect of it. You know, wow, this guy controlled the House. This guy knew what he was doing. He was brilliant. He was funny. And I thought, you know, that doesn't satisfy me as to why you would put up with that kind of abuse. And I kept looking, and finally I went up to Bowdoin Library and went through his papers up there, went through the congressional record. And finally I thought, I got to go back further. So I finally thought, maybe something when his freshman year. So I went to the National Archives, and Rod Ross, who was not here today, had to be someplace else. I didn't know his name then, but I went to the National Archives and I explained to this very nice gentleman. I said, I'm trying to track down why this guy would do something, and you know, I'm all the way back to his first freshman year. And he said, well, I'll get for you what I can. And he came down with 19 metal boxes of files, folders. He said, this is what I had. And I sat there one long day, and I went through all 19 of these folders, and they were from that investigation for the Potter Commission into fraud. And Tom Reed was in Louisiana on July 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, all right, of 1877, I guess it was, and he was taking testimony. And there was this testimony from the lady, or from the people in East Feliciana Parish, given in New Orleans about this dragging the guy around. All right? Now, I was sensitive to that because it's not been that many years since those white guys in Texas, in Jasper, Texas, tied a rope around a guy and dragged him behind a pickup truck. You know? Incidentally, one of the things I did was I visited a site that stunned me in Biloxi, Mississippi, Gulfport, Mississippi. There is a beautiful new granite building, really lovely building. It is a presidential library. It was opened in 1998. How many years ago is that? 12? My math isn't that sharp, is it? Anyway, it is the presidential library of Jefferson Davis. And I was stunned to see that. I thought, don't these guys understand what this was about? Don't they have a clue that Davis was wrong and 600,000 young men died? Statue of Liberty has a bird. And as I describe it in the book, it looks like her head is stuck into the bowels of a bird. Well, the reason that is because Jeff Davis, when he was the powerful man in Washington, realized that the Statue of Liberty was going to be wearing a liberty cap, Statue of Freedom. And the liberty cap was the sign in ancient Greece and Rome of a freed slave. All right? That was what a guy wore when he got free. And Jefferson Davis objected to the idea that the Washington statue on the top of our dome would be so wrong as to depict a freed slave. And so the thing was changed. And every time I look at a picture of that Capitol with that bird, I think somebody's got to go up there someday and put this thing right. But there were no, when I started to write this, there were no artworks in the Capitol that would let you know that there was ever any slavery. All right? You could go anywhere you wanted, and I did a scene on that in a book, but there was nothing that showed that slavery ever existed in America. Now, in the last 10 years or so, the Black Caucus had corrected some of that, and they've got some stuff, but there were no paintings. You have Pocahontas, you have George Washington, you have, oh God, I can't think of all the figures in art that are glorified in the Congress, but you didn't find any of black men, you didn't find any of any of the great leaders. Now there are some. Robert E. Lee has been taken from the statuary hall and put into the downstairs level. All right? You go to New Orleans, which is where I did a lot of the writing, and you go to Lee Circle. Here's New Orleans, which had black mayors, I think 3 in a row, and the biggest monument in New Orleans is Lee Circle, at the top of which is a very proud statue of Robert E. Lee. Well, if I was the descendant of slaves myself and got elected mayor, I'd have had a bulldozer accidentally take that sucker out. But, you know, people forgive and forget, and they try to be more forgiving about it. But, yeah, that East Feliciana Parish, talk to Rod Ross. He'll haul out all 19 boxes, and you can have a ball. But it was educational to read that. It really was. And, again, I've traveled around the country to very poor places and seen a lot of racial difficulties. But when you go back and you read these things and you saw that there was a direct link, the reason that happened in the South was to keep power across the street, right? And Tom Reed had the backbone, the brains to see that, and the backbone to just say, we're taking this out. Anyway, thanks again.